The morning mist hung low over the dense Montana wilderness as Jake Martinez adjusted his worn baseball cap and checked his GPS one more time. At 62, the retired Army sergeant still moved with purpose, though his left leg carried the permanent reminder of an IED blast in Afghanistan 15 years earlier. Beside him, his German Shepherd mix, Ranger, sniffed the air with the intensity of a seasoned tracker. Jake had been hiking these remote mountain trails for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved to the small town of Cedar Falls after his retirement. The solitude helped quiet the voices in his head, the memories that sometimes felt too heavy to carry. Ranger had been his companion for the last 2 years, a rescue dog who seemed to understand Jake's need for peace without judgment. The trail they followed today wasn't marked on any official map. Jake had discovered it during one of his longer expeditions, a narrow path that wound through thick pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Most hikers avoided this area because of its remoteness and the challenging terrain. But that's exactly what drew Jake to it. As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of the valley below. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the promise of winter. Ranger trotted ahead, his ears alert to every sound in the forest. Suddenly, the dog stopped and turned back toward Jake, his tail rigid and his body tense. Jake approached slowly, recognizing the signs. Ranger had found something unusual. Following the dog's gaze, Jake peered through a gap in the trees and felt his breath catch in his throat. There, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and fallen branches, was the unmistakable silhouette of a helicopter. The aircraft sat in a small clearing that was invisible from the main trail. Vines and moss had begun to claim the metal surface, suggesting it had been there for some time. Jake's military training kicked in as he assessed the scene. The helicopter appeared to be a civilian model, possibly from the 1980s based on its design. There were no obvious signs of a crash landing, no scattered debris or gouged earth that would indicate a violent impact. Jake approached cautiously, Ranger staying close to his side. The helicopter's windows were dirty and partially obscured by vegetation, making it impossible to see inside clearly. He walked around the aircraft, noting that the landing gear was intact and properly deployed. This hadn't been a crash, he realized. Someone had landed here intentionally. The paint on the helicopter's hull was faded and peeling, but Jake could make out what appeared to be a registration number on the tail. He pulled out his phone to take a photo, but the signal bars showed zero reception. They were too deep in the wilderness for cellular service. As he circled back to the front of the aircraft, Jake noticed that the pilot's door was slightly ajar. The rubber seal around the door had deteriorated over time, allowing moisture and insects to enter the cabin. He could see that the interior had been affected by years of exposure to the elements. Ranger whined softly and pawed at Jake's leg. The dog's behavior suggested he sensed something important about this discovery. Jake had learned to trust Ranger's instincts both on their hikes and in the years since they'd been together. Jake tried the door handle and found that it opened easily, the hinges creaking in protest. The smell that emerged was musty and stale, mixed with the odor of deteriorating materials. The pilot's seat was empty, but Jake could see personal items scattered around the cabin. A water bottle green with algae sat in a cup holder. A folded map was wedged between the seats, and what appeared to be a leather jacket hung from a hook near the door. The instrument panel was dark and covered with a thin layer of dust and debris. Jake noticed that the key was still in the ignition, suggesting that whoever had landed here had intended to return. The fuel gauge showed empty, which might explain why the helicopter had never left this remote location. Behind the pilot's seats, Jake could see into the passenger compartment. There appeared to be several items secured with cargo netting, but the dirty windows and dim lighting made it difficult to identify them clearly. He would need a flashlight to properly investigate the interior. Jake stepped back from the helicopter and considered his options. As a veteran, he understood the importance of following proper procedures when discovering abandoned military or civilian aircraft. This helicopter would need to be reported to the authorities, but the remote location made immediate communication impossible. He decided to make a basic survey of the area before heading back to town. Walking around the clearing, Jake looked for any additional clues about how long the helicopter had been there, or what circumstances had led to its abandonment. He found no obvious camping equipment or signs that anyone had stayed in the area for an extended period. The clearing itself was natural, formed by a gap in the forest canopy that allowed enough sunlight for grass and wildflowers to grow. It was an ideal landing spot for a small helicopter, hidden from view but with enough space for safe operations. Ranger continued to show interest in the aircraft, occasionally approaching the open door and sniffing before retreating to Jake's side. The dog's behavior suggested there might be scents or sounds that Jake couldn't detect. As the afternoon light began to fade, Jake made the decision to return the next day with proper equipment. He needed a flashlight, camera, and possibly some basic tools to conduct a more thorough investigation. He also wanted to bring a satellite communicator to contact the authorities once he had a better understanding of what they were dealing with. Before leaving, Jake carefully closed the helicopter door and marked the location on his GPS unit. He took several photos with his phone, even though he couldn't transmit them immediately. The discovery would need to be documented properly. As they began the hike back to the main trail, Jake's mind raced with questions. Who had landed this helicopter in such a remote location? Why had they left it behind? And what were those items secured in the passenger compartment? The walk back to his truck took nearly 2 hours, and by the time they reached the parking area, the sun was setting behind the mountains. Jake loaded Ranger into the vehicle and began the drive back to Cedar Falls, already planning his return trip to the mysterious helicopter hidden deep in the Montana wilderness. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the helicopter sitting in that remote clearing, waiting like a puzzle that demanded to be solved. By dawn, he was already loading his backpack with supplies for the return trip. He packed a high-powered flashlight, extra batteries, a digital camera, basic tools, and his satellite communicator. Ranger watched from his bed in the corner, sensing the tension in his owner's movements. The drive back to the trailhead took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads. Jake arrived early enough that his truck was the only vehicle in the small parking area. He preferred it that way, needing the solitude to process whatever they might discover today. The hike to the helicopter felt different this time. Jake found himself moving faster, driven by curiosity and a growing sense that this discovery was more significant than he'd initially realized. Ranger seemed to pick up on the urgency, staying closer to Jake's side and occasionally looking up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand more than a dog should. When they reached the clearing, Jake was struck again by how well hidden the aircraft was. Even knowing exactly where to look, it would be easy to miss if someone wasn't specifically searching for it. The helicopter sat exactly as they'd left it, undisturbed by the night's activity in the forest. Jake approached the pilot's door and opened it carefully. This time he was prepared for the musty smell and poor visibility inside the cabin. He switched on his flashlight and began a systematic examination of the interior. The pilot's seat showed significant wear and fading from years of exposure to sunlight filtering through the windows. Personal items were scattered throughout the cockpit area. Jake photographed everything before touching anything, documenting the scene as he'd been trained to do during his military service. A wallet lay wedged between the pilot's seat and the center console. Jake carefully extracted it and opened it with gloved hands. The leather was stiff and discolored, but the contents were still readable. The driver's license belonged to Robert Chen, age 34 at the time of issue. The photo showed an Asian American man with short black hair and serious eyes. The license had expired 12 years ago. Inside the wallet, Jake found credit cards, a few business cards, and a small photograph of a young woman holding a baby. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Sarah and Emma, 1995," in fading blue ink. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't just an abandoned helicopter. It was someone's life interrupted. The logbook in the side pocket revealed more of the story. Robert Chen had been a certified pilot who operated a small charter service out of Billings. The final entry in the logbook was dated October 15th, 13 years ago. The flight plan indicated a trip from Billings to a private ranch near the Canadian border, but there was no return entry. Jake examined the instrument panel more carefully. Everything appeared to be in normal position except for the fuel gauge, which showed completely empty. The fuel shutoff valve was in the correct position, and there were no obvious signs of mechanical failure. It seemed Robert had simply run out of fuel and made an emergency landing in the clearing, but that raised more questions. Why hadn't he used his radio to call for help? Why hadn't anyone come looking for him? Jake checked the radio equipment and found it appeared to be functional, though obviously not operational without power. Moving to the passenger compartment, Jake's flashlight beam revealed what had been hidden in the shadows the previous day. 3 large duffel bags were secured against the back wall with cargo netting. Each bag was made of heavy canvas and appeared to be military surplus. They were locked with heavy-duty padlocks that had resisted 13 years of moisture and temperature changes. Jake photographed the bags from multiple angles before attempting to examine them more closely. The locks were substantial, clearly designed to protect valuable contents. Whatever Robert Chen had been transporting, it was important enough to secure carefully. Ranger had been waiting patiently outside the helicopter, but now he approached the open door and whined softly. The dog's nose twitched as he sniffed the air coming from the passenger compartment. His behavior suggested he detected something specific, though Jake couldn't identify any particular odor beyond the general mustiness of the abandoned aircraft. Jake found a clipboard wedged under one of the seats with what appeared to be shipping documents. The papers were water-damaged and partially illegible, but he could make out fragments of information. The destination was listed as Thompson Ranch, Glacier County, and there were references to specialized equipment and confidential delivery. The documents bore the letterhead of a company called Northern Security Solutions, but the address and contact information were too damaged to read clearly. Jake photographed every page, hoping that digital enhancement might reveal more details later. As he continued his investigation, Jake discovered a small cooler under the passenger seat. The contents had long since spoiled, but the presence of food and drink suggested that Robert had been prepared for a longer journey. There was also a sleeping bag rolled up behind the seats, indicating he might have planned to stay overnight at his destination. The mystery deepened when Jake found a second set of keys in the ignition area. These weren't aircraft keys but appeared to be for a vehicle, possibly a truck or SUV. The key ring held several keys and a small metal tag with the number 247 engraved on it. Jake's satellite communicator finally acquired a signal as he worked outside the helicopter. He considered calling the authorities immediately but decided to complete his documentation first. The helicopter had been here for 13 years. A few more hours wouldn't matter. The sun was directly overhead when Jake made his most significant discovery. While examining the area around the helicopter, he noticed disturbed earth near a large pine tree about 50 yards from the aircraft. The vegetation in that spot was different from the surrounding area, suggesting the ground had been excavated and refilled at some point. Ranger seemed particularly interested in this area, pawing at the ground and whining. Jake knelt down and brushed away the surface layer of pine needles and debris. The soil underneath was definitely different, darker and more compact than the surrounding earth. Jake stood up and looked back at the helicopter, then at the disturbed ground. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture, but it wasn't a comforting one. Robert Chen had landed here 13 years ago, carrying locked bags of mysterious contents with plans to stay overnight. But his helicopter was still here, and there were signs that someone had been digging in the forest. As he packed up his equipment, Jake made a decision. This discovery was beyond his ability to handle alone. The satellite communicator showed 3 bars of signal strength, enough for a clear conversation. It was time to call the authorities and report what they'd found. But first he wanted to take one more look at those locked duffel bags. Something about them bothered him, beyond just their mysterious contents. As his flashlight beam swept over them again, Jake noticed something he'd missed earlier. Small holes in the canvas, perfectly round and about the size of a pencil. They looked deliberately made, not the result of age or animal damage. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what those holes might represent. Ventilation holes. Whatever was in those bags had needed air, and if his growing suspicions were correct, this remote clearing in the Montana wilderness held secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he activated the satellite communicator. The device chirped as it connected to the emergency services dispatcher in Glacier County. He took a deep breath and began explaining his discovery, trying to keep his voice steady as he described the abandoned helicopter and the evidence he'd found. The dispatcher, a woman named Carol, listened intently as Jake provided the GPS coordinates and described his background as a military veteran. She assured him that sheriff's deputies and a helicopter recovery team would be dispatched immediately, but warned that reaching the remote location would take several hours. While waiting for the authorities, Jake decided to conduct one final examination of the area. Something nagged at him about the timeline. If Robert Chen had made an emergency landing due to fuel shortage, why hadn't he attempted to walk out for help? The helicopter was only about 8 miles from the nearest road, a difficult but manageable hike for an experienced outdoorsman. Jake studied the helicopter's position more carefully. It wasn't just hidden from the main trail, it was positioned to be invisible from aircraft flying overhead. The natural canopy provided perfect concealment from aerial searches. This suggested that Robert had chosen this landing spot deliberately, not as an emergency measure. Ranger continued to show interest in the disturbed ground near the pine tree. Jake knelt down again and began carefully scraping away more of the surface debris. About 6 inches down, his fingers encountered something that made his stomach lurch. Fabric. Faded blue denim that had been buried for years. Jake immediately stopped digging and stood up, his military training overriding his curiosity. This was now a potential crime scene, and any further excavation needed to be done by professionals. He took photographs of the exposed fabric and marked the location with a small cairn of stones. As he waited, Jake's mind raced through the implications of what he'd discovered. Robert Chen had landed his helicopter in this remote location, carrying mysterious cargo in locked bags. He'd never left the area, and someone had dug a grave in the nearby forest. The conclusion seemed obvious, but Jake had learned during his military service that obvious answers weren't always correct. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted his thoughts. 2 aircraft appeared over the tree line, a sheriff's department helicopter and a larger transport helicopter, carrying what appeared to be recovery equipment. Jake activated his emergency strobe to guide them to the clearing. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos was the first to reach Jake after the helicopters landed. A compact woman in her 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes. She'd been working mountain rescues and investigations for over 15 years. She listened carefully as Jake walked her through his discoveries, taking detailed notes and photographs. "You did the right thing calling this in," Deputy Santos said as she examined the abandoned helicopter. This aircraft was reported missing 13 years ago, but the search was called off after 6 months. The family never stopped looking for Robert Chen. Jake felt a surge of emotion at hearing those words. Somewhere, Robert's family had been wondering what happened to him for 13 years. The photo of the woman and baby in his wallet suddenly took on new significance. Detective Ray Harrison arrived 30 minutes later in the transport helicopter, along with a team of forensic specialists. A tall man with 25 years of law enforcement experience, Harrison had worked dozens of missing person cases in Montana's wilderness areas. He approached the investigation with the methodical patience of someone who understood that evidence told stories, if you knew how to read it. "Tell me about the bags in the helicopter," Detective Harrison said after reviewing Jake's documentation. "You said they appeared to have ventilation holes?" Jake nodded and led the detective to the aircraft. Under proper lighting equipment, the holes in the canvas bags were clearly visible. Detective Harrison examined them closely with a magnifying glass. "These were definitely made intentionally," he confirmed, "and recently, probably within the last few hours before the helicopter landed here. Someone modified these bags to allow air circulation." The forensic team began processing the helicopter, while Detective Harrison and Jake walked to the site of the disturbed ground. When Harrison saw the exposed fabric, his expression grew serious. "We'll need to treat this as a homicide investigation until we know otherwise," he said. "I'm going to ask you to step back while we process the scene, but I want you to know that your discovery here may finally give a family the answers they've been seeking for 13 years. As the afternoon progressed, Jake watched the professional investigation unfold. The forensic team photographed and documented every inch of the helicopter and the surrounding area. A ground-penetrating radar unit confirmed the presence of disturbed earth in multiple locations around the pine tree. The most significant development came when the team managed to open one of the locked duffel bags. Detective Harrison called Jake over to witness the contents, knowing that his military experience might provide valuable context. Inside the bag, carefully wrapped in plastic sheeting, were bundles of cash. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in various denominations, all neatly organized and protected from moisture. But more disturbing were the other items in the bag. Military-grade weapons and communication equipment that clearly weren't legal for civilian ownership. This wasn't a charter flight, Detective Harrison said grimly. Robert Chen was involved in something that got him killed. The second bag contained more weapons and what appeared to be stolen military equipment, including night vision devices and encrypted radio systems. The serial numbers had been filed off, but forensic analysis might still be able to trace their origins. The third bag held the most shocking discovery: personal identification documents from multiple individuals, including passports, driver's licenses, and social security cards. Most were clearly forgeries, but the quality was professional grade. Someone had been running a sophisticated identity theft operation. As evening approached, the excavation near the pine tree confirmed everyone's worst fears. The remains were definitely human, and preliminary examination suggested they'd been buried for approximately 13 years. Personal effects found with the remains, including a watch and wedding ring, matched the description of items Robert Chen was known to wear. Detective Harrison pulled Jake aside as the evidence collection continued. "I need to ask you about your background," he said. "Your military record, security clearance, anything that might be relevant to this case." Jake was puzzled by the question until Harrison explained. "The equipment in those bags includes some items that are classified at very high levels. The fact that they ended up in a civilian helicopter suggests we're dealing with more than just a simple murder. This could involve national security issues." As the investigation team prepared to transport the helicopter and evidence back to the forensics laboratory, Jake realized that his quiet hike in the wilderness had uncovered something much larger than an abandoned aircraft. Robert Chen had been killed because of what he was carrying, but the real question was whether he'd been a victim or a participant in whatever illegal operation those bags represented. Deputy Santos approached Jake as the helicopters prepared to depart. "We're going to need you to come in for a formal statement tomorrow," she said. "And I have to ask you not to discuss this with anyone until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Jake nodded his agreement, but as he hiked back to his truck with Ranger, he couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was going to change his quiet retirement in ways he never could have imagined. The secrets buried in that remote clearing had been waiting 13 years to be found, and now that they were exposed, Jake suspected there were people who would do anything to keep those secrets from becoming public. Jake spent a restless night in his small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Every sound in the darkness made him reach for the .45 pistol he kept in his nightstand drawer. Ranger seemed equally unsettled, pacing the house and occasionally growling at shadows outside the windows. By morning, Jake had convinced himself that his paranoia was just a reaction to the previous day's discoveries. But that feeling changed when he found fresh tire tracks in his driveway that definitely weren't his. The tracks were from a large vehicle, possibly an SUV or pickup truck, and they led right up to his front porch before turning around. Someone had been watching his house during the night. Jake photographed the tracks and called Detective Harrison immediately. "I was about to call you anyway," Harrison said when Jake reported the incident. "We need to meet this morning, but not at the sheriff's office. There are some developments in the case that require discretion." They arranged to meet at a small diner 30 miles outside of town, a place where they could talk without being overheard. Jake arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner where he could watch the entrance. When Harrison walked in 20 minutes later, he wasn't alone. A woman in her 50s with short gray hair and professional attire accompanied him. "Jake, this is Agent Linda Crawford from the FBI," Harrison said as they sat down. "The items we found in that helicopter have attracted federal attention." Agent Crawford studied Jake with the intense gaze of someone accustomed to reading people's motivations and honesty. "Mr. Martinez, I need to ask you some questions about your military service, specifically your security clearance and any special operations you may have been involved in." Jake answered her questions carefully, describing his tours in Afghanistan and his work as a military intelligence analyst. He'd held a top-secret clearance for most of his career and had been involved in several classified operations, though nothing he could discuss in detail. "The reason I'm asking," Agent Crawford explained, "is that some of the equipment we found in Robert Chen's helicopter was stolen from a classified military research facility in 2012. The theft was never solved, and we suspected it was an inside job." Jake felt a chill as the implications became clear. "You think I was involved in the theft?" We have to consider all possibilities, Crawford replied. But what's more concerning is that your discovery of the helicopter might not have been accidental. Someone may have led you to that location deliberately. Harrison leaned forward across the table. Tell us again about how you found that trail. Had anyone suggested that hiking area to you? Did anyone know about your plans to hike there? Jake thought carefully about the past few months. He'd been hiking the remote mountain areas around Cedar Falls for 3 years, gradually exploring more challenging and isolated trails. The specific path that led to the helicopter was one he'd discovered during a longer expedition about 6 months earlier. I found that trail on my own, Jake said. I keep detailed maps of all my hiking routes, and I can show you exactly how I came across it. But there is something I should mention. About 3 weeks ago, I met another hiker on one of the main trails who asked me about remote areas in this region. Agent Crawford's attention sharpened. Describe this person. Middle-aged man, maybe 45 to 50. Said his name was Bill Thompson. He was well-equipped, clearly an experienced hiker. He asked specifically about areas that weren't on the official trail maps. I didn't think much of it at the time, but he seemed particularly interested when I mentioned some of the more isolated locations. Harrison and Crawford exchanged glances. Can you describe him in more detail? Harrison asked. Jake closed his eyes and tried to recall the encounter. About 6 feet tall, stocky build, dark hair with some gray. He had a slight accent, maybe East Coast. He was driving a dark green SUV with out-of-state plates, though I can't remember which state. Agent Crawford made notes as Jake spoke. This could be significant. We believe there may be other people involved in the original theft who've been trying to locate the missing equipment for years. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, providing a momentary break in the intense conversation. When she moved away, Crawford continued. Here's what we know so far. Robert Chen was a legitimate helicopter pilot, but he got involved with a group that was stealing and selling military equipment. The operation was sophisticated, involving people with high-level security clearances and access to classified facilities. Harrison took over the explanation. The forensic examination of Chen's remains suggests he was shot execution style. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a professional killing. Someone wanted to make sure he couldn't reveal information about the theft operation. But why leave the helicopter and equipment there for 13 years? Jake asked. If they killed Chen for the stolen items, why not take them? That's what puzzles us, Crawford admitted. Our theory is that something went wrong with their plan. Maybe they were interrupted, or maybe Chen hid something they still haven't found. Jake thought about the locked bags and the sophisticated equipment they contained. Could Chen have been trying to expose the operation? Maybe he was taking the evidence to someone who could stop it. That's possible, Crawford said. The shipping documents you found mentioned Thompson Ranch in Glacier County. We're investigating whether that was a real destination or a cover story. Harrison's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly and his expression grew serious. We need to get you somewhere safe, he told Jake. That was my office. Someone broke into the evidence storage facility last night and tried to access the items from the helicopter. Jake felt his stomach drop. Did they get anything? No, but they knew exactly what they were looking for. This confirms that there are people still active in this operation who want those weapons and documents back. Agent Crawford stood up from the booth. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to recommend that you enter protective custody until we can identify and arrest the remaining members of this group. They've already killed once to protect their secrets, and your discovery of the helicopter makes you a target. Jake shook his head. I'm not hiding from anyone. I've got military training and I can take care of myself. Besides, they've had 13 years to cover their tracks. How are you going to find them now? Because they're making mistakes, Crawford replied. Breaking into the evidence facility, watching your house, these are desperate actions by people who are running out of options. We can use that desperation to our advantage. Harrison leaned back in his seat. There's something else you should know. We ran the serial numbers on some of the weapons, and despite being filed off, our lab was able to recover partial markings. The equipment was stolen from 3 different military facilities over a period of 6 months in 2012. That suggests a coordinated operation with inside help at multiple locations, Crawford added. We're talking about a conspiracy that could involve dozens of people, including active military personnel and defense contractors. Jake thought about his quiet life in Cedar Falls and how dramatically it had changed in just 2 days. What do you need from me? Right now, we need you to be careful and report any suspicious activity, Harrison said. We also want you to think carefully about anyone you've met since moving to Cedar Falls, who might have shown unusual interest in your background or your hiking activities. As they prepared to leave the diner, Agent Crawford handed Jake a secure phone. This connects directly to a federal task force investigating this case. If you see anything suspicious, anything at all, use this phone immediately. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt different now. Jake found himself checking his mirrors constantly and taking random turns to see if anyone was following him. When he reached his cabin, he noticed that Ranger was already alert and agitated before they got out of the truck. Inside the house, Jake went through each room systematically, checking for signs that someone had been inside. Everything appeared normal until he reached his study. His hiking maps and GPS unit were exactly where he'd left them, but his computer monitor was warm to the touch despite being turned off when he left that morning. Someone had been in his house while he was meeting with the investigators. They'd accessed his computer and probably copied his hiking records and trail maps. Jake realized with growing alarm that the people responsible for Robert Chen's death now knew exactly where he hiked and when. As evening approached, Jake settled in with Ranger to wait and watch. The secure phone sat on the table beside his chair, and his service pistol was within easy reach. Whatever secrets had been buried with Robert Chen 13 years ago were about to surface, and Jake found himself at the center of a conspiracy that was far from over. Outside, the Montana wilderness held its breath, waiting for the next chapter in a story that had been interrupted by violence years earlier, but was now approaching its final, dangerous conclusion. Jake woke to Ranger's low growling at 3 a.m. The dog stood rigid by the bedroom window, his hackles raised and ears pointed toward the front of the house. Jake grabbed his pistol and moved carefully to a position where he could see the driveway without exposing himself to the windows. 2 dark SUVs sat in his driveway with their engines running, but headlights off. Jake could see the silhouettes of multiple figures moving around his property, positioning themselves strategically around the cabin. These weren't burglars or random criminals. They moved with military precision and coordination. Jake activated the secure phone Agent Crawford had given him, but before he could complete the call, a powerful spotlight blazed through his front window, temporarily blinding him. A voice spoke through a megaphone from outside. "Mr. Martinez, we know you're in there. We need to talk to you about what you found in the mountains. Come out with your hands visible and no one gets hurt." Jake's military training kicked in as he assessed his tactical situation. The cabin had 2 exits, front and back, but both were probably covered. The windows were large enough to provide escape routes, but breaking glass would alert the attackers to his position. He had adequate ammunition, but was outnumbered by an unknown quantity of armed individuals. "What do you want?" Jake called out, buying time while he considered his options. "You found something that belongs to us," the voice replied. "We need to discuss how to resolve this situation quietly." Jake knew that anyone willing to murder Robert Chen 13 years ago wouldn't hesitate to kill him now. These people had spent over a decade covering up their crimes, and his discovery of the helicopter threatened to expose everything. Moving carefully through the darkened house, Jake made his way to the back bedroom where he kept emergency supplies. He'd prepared this room as a safe position during his first months in the cabin, when nightmares and hypervigilance from his military service made him feel the need for defensive preparations. From a concealed compartment, Jake retrieved night vision goggles, extra ammunition, and a tactical radio. He also grabbed the detailed maps of the surrounding wilderness that covered his walls. If he could get outside the cabin, the mountainous terrain would give him significant advantages over attackers who weren't familiar with the area. The spotlight continued to illuminate the front of the house while Jake heard quiet movement around the perimeter. Someone was trying to approach the back door. Jake positioned Ranger in the bathroom, the safest room in the house, and whispered commands for the dog to stay quiet and hidden. Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming call on the secure line. Agent Crawford's voice was tense when he answered. "Jake, we're tracking your location and federal agents are en route, but they're 40 minutes out. You need to stay alive until we get there." "They're surrounding the house," Jake whispered. "At least 6 people, possibly more. They want to discuss what I found, but I don't think they're planning a friendly conversation." "Do not go outside," Crawford warned. "These people are professionals and they're desperate." "We've identified some of the names from the forged documents in Chen's helicopter. This conspiracy involves former military personnel and defense contractors who've been selling stolen weapons to foreign buyers for years." Jake heard the back door handle being tested quietly. "They're trying to get inside now. I'm going to have to move." "There's something else you need to know," Crawford said urgently. "We found evidence that Robert Chen was an undercover federal agent. He was trying to expose this weapons trafficking operation when they killed him. The equipment in his helicopter was evidence he'd gathered to bring down the entire network. That revelation changed everything. Chen hadn't been a criminal. He'd been a hero trying to stop a crime. The people outside Jake's cabin were the same ones who had murdered a federal agent 13 years ago." The sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen. Jake ended the call and moved toward the rear of the house, staying low and using furniture for cover. Through his night vision goggles, he could see a figure climbing through the kitchen window. Jake had two choices: try to hide and hope the federal agents arrived in time, or take the initiative and use his knowledge of the terrain to even the odds. His military experience had taught him that passive defense rarely succeeded against determined attackers. Making his decision, Jake opened the bedroom window as quietly as possible and slipped outside into the cold mountain air. The attackers had positioned themselves to watch the doors but hadn't anticipated an escape through the bedroom window on the cabin's blind side. Moving through the darkness using techniques learned in Afghanistan, Jake circled around behind the SUVs. He could see muzzle flashes inside his cabin as the intruders searched the rooms, probably firing to suppress any resistance they might encounter. Jake reached the first SUV and quickly slashed two tires with his military knife. As he moved toward the second vehicle, he heard shouting from inside the cabin. They'd discovered he wasn't there. "He's not in the house," someone yelled. "Check the perimeter." Flashlight beams began sweeping the area around the cabin. Jake dropped prone behind a large pine tree and watched as the attackers regrouped. He counted 7 men, all armed with automatic weapons and wearing military-style gear. From his concealed position, Jake could hear their radio communications. They were coordinating a systematic search of the surrounding area, using tactics that confirmed their military background. But they were operating in unfamiliar territory. While Jake had spent 3 years learning every trail, rock formation, and hiding spot in these mountains, Jake began moving deeper into the forest, using the terrain to his advantage. His plan was to lead the attackers away from the cabin and into the rugged wilderness where their numbers and weapons would matter less than knowledge of the local geography. Behind him, he could hear them organizing into search teams. Vehicle doors slammed as they retrieved additional equipment. Powerful searchlights began probing the forest. But Jake was already several hundred yards away and moving steadily uphill toward a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide excellent defensive positions. His secure phone vibrated with a text. Message from Agent Crawford. "Federal agents 25 minutes out. Survival is your only objective." Jake reached a narrow canyon that he'd explored extensively during his hikes. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, but led to a series of caves and overlooks that would allow him to observe and potentially ambush his pursuers. More importantly, there were multiple escape routes if his position became compromised. The sound of pursuit grew closer as the search teams spread out through the forest. Their flashlights and radio chatter made them easy to track. But Jake knew they would eventually corner him if he couldn't reduce their numbers or reach a position where federal agents could intervene. As he climbed higher into the rocky terrain, Jake thought about Robert Chen and the courage it had taken to go undercover in a dangerous weapons trafficking operation. Chen had died trying to expose these criminals, and now Jake found himself in a similar position, fighting to survive long enough to see justice done. The first pursuer reached the canyon entrance just as Jake reached a natural observation post 50 feet above. Through his night vision goggles, Jake could see the man scanning the narrow passage with his flashlight, trying to determine if this was the route his quarry had taken. Jake made a decision that would have consequences for everyone involved in the 13-year-old conspiracy. Instead of hiding and hoping to avoid detection, he decided to send a message that would change the tactical situation dramatically. Taking careful aim with his pistol, Jake fired a single shot that struck the rock face inches from the searcher's head. The man dove for cover and immediately began shouting into his radio. "Contact! He's in the rocks above the canyon." Jake was no longer just a witness to be silenced. He had become an active participant in a battle that would determine whether Robert Chen's sacrifice had any meaning, and whether a conspiracy involving stolen military weapons would finally be exposed. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, alerting every searcher to Jake's position. Within minutes, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as the attackers opened fire on the rocky outcropping where Jake had taken cover. Bullets sparked off stone surfaces and whined through the air, but the natural fortification provided excellent protection. Jake used the chaos to his advantage, moving between defensive positions while the attackers wasted ammunition on empty rocks. His night vision goggles gave him a crucial advantage in the darkness, allowing him to track their movements while remaining invisible to their flashlights and thermal scopes. From his elevated position, Jake could see that the attackers had split into 3 groups. 2 teams were attempting to scale the canyon walls on either side of his position, while a 3rd group guarded the only easy escape route. They were executing a classic pincer movement designed to trap him in the rocks. Jake's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. Federal agents 10 minutes out. Helicopter support en route. Hold your position. 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours given the current tactical situation. The attackers were closing in from multiple directions, and Jake's ammunition wouldn't last long against 7 determined opponents with automatic weapons. But Jake had spent 3 years exploring these mountains, and he knew something his attackers didn't. The cave system behind his current position connected to a series of underground passages that emerged nearly a quarter-mile away. If he could reach the caves without being detected, he could disappear completely and emerge behind the attackers' lines. Using a small mirror from his emergency kit, Jake reflected one of the searchers' flashlight beams to create the illusion of movement in a different location. As the attackers concentrated their fire on the false target, Jake slipped into the cave entrance behind his position. The caves were pitch black and treacherous, but Jake had mapped them carefully during previous expeditions. Moving by feel and memory, he navigated through narrow passages and around underground obstacles toward the exit he'd discovered months earlier. As he moved through the darkness, Jake heard the sound of helicopters approaching from the east. Federal agents were finally arriving, but the attackers were still hunting for him in the rocks above. The situation was about to become much more complicated. Jake emerged from the cave system behind a screen of pine trees, approximately 300 yards from where the attackers were still searching for him. Through his night vision goggles, he could see muzzle flashes and hear radio chatter as they continued their assault on empty rocks. The federal helicopters appeared over the ridge, their searchlights illuminating the forest. But instead of landing immediately, they began circling the area, probably trying to identify targets and avoid hitting Jake in the crossfire. One of the attackers must have realized they'd been outmaneuvered, because Jake heard urgent radio communications about withdrawing to their vehicles. The arrival of federal agents had changed the tactical situation dramatically, and the conspiracy members were now the ones trying to escape. Jake began moving toward the original attack site, planning to intercept the retreat route. As he moved through the forest, he came across one of the attackers who had become separated from his team during the confusion. The man was moving quickly through the darkness, using a flashlight and making enough noise to wake every animal in the forest. Jake approached silently from behind and called out in a commanding voice, "Federal agent, drop your weapon and get on the ground." The man spun around, raising his automatic rifle, but Jake was ready. A single shot from his pistol dropped the attacker before he could fire. Jake quickly secured the man's weapons and radio, then used zip ties from his emergency kit to restrain him. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications as the remaining attackers realized they were surrounded by federal agents and had lost contact with one of their team members. Their military precision was breaking down as fear and confusion took over. Jake keyed the captured radio and spoke in a calm, authoritative voice. "This is Jake Martinez. I have one of your people in custody and federal agents have you surrounded. The 13-year cover-up is over. Robert Chen's evidence is going to expose your entire operation." The radio went silent for several moments before a different voice responded. "Martinez, you don't understand what you're interfering with. This operation involves people at the highest levels of government and defense contractors. Chen was going to destroy careers and national security relationships." "Chen was a federal agent doing his job," Jake replied, "and you murdered him for it." Through the radio, Jake could hear the sound of vehicles starting and engines revving. The remaining attackers were attempting to flee, but federal helicopters were already moving to intercept their escape routes. Jake made his way back toward his cabin, using the captured radio to coordinate with Agent Crawford and the federal response teams. The night sky was lit up with searchlights and the sound of helicopters as the 13-year-old conspiracy finally unraveled. When Jake reached the clearing around his cabin, he found Agent Crawford directing operations from a mobile command center. Federal agents had arrested 4 of the attackers, while 3 others had died during the firefight in the canyon when they refused to surrender. "Are you injured?" Crawford asked as Jake approached with his prisoner. "I'm fine," Jake replied, "but we need to check on my dog. I left him in the house during the attack." Inside the cabin, they found Ranger exactly where Jake had left him, scared but unharmed. The house had been searched and vandalized, but the damage was repairable. Crawford briefed Jake on what they'd learned from the arrested attackers. The weapons trafficking operation had involved a network of corrupt military personnel, defense contractors, and foreign buyers stretching across multiple countries. Robert Chen had been working undercover for 2 years to gather evidence when he was murdered. The equipment in Chen's helicopter was just a small sample of what they'd stolen, Crawford explained. "We estimate they sold over $50 million worth of classified military technology to hostile foreign governments." Detective Harrison arrived as dawn broke over the mountains. "We found the Thompson Ranch location mentioned in Chen's shipping documents," he reported. "It was a front operation for storing and transferring stolen weapons. The site was abandoned after Chen's murder, but we recovered enough evidence to identify the entire network." Jake sat on his front porch as the sun rose, watching federal agents process the crime scene and load evidence into helicopters. Ranger lay beside him, finally relaxed after the long night of violence and chaos. Agent Crawford joined them on the porch. "The Justice Department is going to prosecute this as a national security case," she said. "Your discovery of that helicopter has given us enough evidence to bring down a conspiracy that's been operating for over 15 years. "What about Robert Chen's family?" Jake asked. "Do they know what really happened to him?" "We notified them this morning," Crawford replied.
"His wife Sarah and daughter Emma are flying in tomorrow."
"They want to meet the man who finally found their husband and father." Jake thought about the photograph in Chen's wallet, the image of a young woman holding a baby. That baby was now a teenager who would finally learn that her father had died as a hero, not a criminal. In the weeks that followed, Jake testified before a federal grand jury and helped prosecutors build cases against the surviving members of the weapons trafficking network. 17 people were eventually arrested, including active military personnel and executives from major defense contractors. The story made national headlines when the Justice Department announced the arrests. Robert Chen was posthumously honored as a federal agent who had given his life to protect national security. His family received full benefits and recognition for his sacrifice. Jake returned to his quiet life in Cedar Falls, but with a new sense of purpose. He began volunteering with organizations that helped families of missing persons, using his experience to provide hope and support to others who were searching for answers. The helicopter was eventually removed from the remote mountain clearing and displayed at the FBI Training Academy as a reminder of the importance of thorough investigation and the courage required to expose high-level corruption. On quiet evenings, Jake would sit on his porch with Ranger and look up at the mountains where their simple hike had uncovered 13 years of buried secrets. The wilderness had kept Robert Chen's story hidden for over a decade, but it had also preserved the evidence that finally brought his killers to justice. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we least expect them, and sometimes a single decision to explore an unmarked trail can change everything. For Jake Martinez and his faithful companion Ranger, that discovery in the Montana wilderness proved that the truth, no matter how long buried, will eventually find a way to surface.